So Donna, because she's practiced at this, and a number of you have commented on this, both to her and to me, is able to deal with a wide variety of material and hold your attention, because you're going to wonder whether she's really going to be able to put it all together. And I find that extraordinary, and the astonishing thing is the way she does it. I'm not nearly as good at that. And this, I found myself, when I was preparing for this morning's session, kind of overwhelmed by the amount of material that I had. So this will not be nearly as well organized as Donna was a few minutes ago. And I do want to open it up to questions, because I know lots of folks, and I don't want the questions just to come in the last 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because these are issues, I think, that a lot of you, at least based on what people have been telling me for the last few weeks, a lot of you have thought about off and on over the years, and they're still live issues, and they were especially live last weekend, right, as we celebrated the 250th, or didn't celebrate the 250th, or alternatively celebrated and watched very peculiar celebrations of the 250th July 4th. So this is not going to be particularly well organized, but I hope it'll hit some high points, and I'll show you some of what is most interesting to me in the research and thinking that I've done about this. And I'll begin with something that I had completely forgotten about until yesterday evening or this morning. And that is that I wrote an article about this entire subject for the Chronicle of Higher Education and published it in the weeks or so after, a few weeks after the election of Barack Obama in 2008. I tried to get a copy of it, but it's behind the Chronicle of Higher Education paywall. And I don't have a copy with me. Donna reminded me that we have a subscription to the Chronicle, so I could have gotten that. But then the internet was out here. And so it only came on in the middle of the service. So on the other hand, ChatGPT gave me an extremely good summary of my article. Which maybe is one of those new ways in which the human and technology are interacting that the Franciscan nun was talking about that Pope Leo may have missed. So I want to talk a little bit about that article and the thinking that led to it, and then I want to broaden beyond my experience to lots of other people's experience. I grew up in a military family. My father was a career naval officer. I wanted to be like him. I wanted to be a Navy pilot. I had this idea that I wanted to be the first Jewish admiral in the Navy. I didn't realize that Rickenbacker had already done that, but I still wanted to do it. And I counted myself a very patriotic young man. And my feelings about the Stars and Stripes Forever come straight from my youth, which I loved hearing. I always got taken to military band concerts. I thrilled to patriotic music. And I thrilled to the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner and all of that. And I considered myself extremely patriotic, and I would get lumps in my throat, even though, you know, boys are not supposed to do that when they're adolescents. So the Vietnam War changed everything for me around patriotism. For the first time in my life, I really began questioning the actions of my government, especially in wartime, which is something that it's kind of hard to do. And in previous, I learned that there were long traditions of this, but they're relatively small traditions for the previous 100 years or so. And Vietnam, as it was for me, was a kind of central experience of my life. And I see people nodding, both men and women. I mean, it was really the only subject when I went off to college in the fall of 1969. Men my age remember their numbers. The women that knew us well remember the numbers. And this was the biggest subject in front of us. What would we do? Where are we going to go? What happened if we drafted? We had, if you were my age, and I'm 75, you had a student deferment. If you were a little bit older, you got student deferments. If you were a little bit younger, you lost a student deferment. So what you were going to do about the war decided everything. And my patriotism took a different kind of turn. In fact, I'd say I'd lost my patriotism because for me and for the folks I was going to school with, for the most part, the government had kind of become the enemy. And the deeper I began to learn about the war, a war that I hated and fortunately was able to avoid, many people were not so fortunate, I turned strongly against my government. And then I saw, and part of the difficulty for me was the way that Richard Nixon and the folks who supported the war got the flag. And that was really tough for me because I felt like I'd lost the flag to militarism. I'd lost the flag to a brutal, unnecessary war, and a war that kept going for a good 7, 8, 9 years after a majority of the American people opposed it. And so for me, the defining moments, the defining experiences of my life were around the Vietnam War and the administration of Richard Nixon. And of course, Watergate was one of the great delights of my life. But to watch the flag and American patriotism and love of country be completely, have it become something that was part of the Republican Party and part of people that I considered warmongers, was really, really hard for me. And I lost my interest in the flag. And so flag waving to me then became something that the opposition did for a really long time. And so I lost my patriotism, or I lost the kind of patriotism I had as a kid. Now, as a historian and as someone studying U.S. history, I saw that when people marched for the 19th Amendment, for instance, or for civil rights, I saw that those protesters carried American flags. And I sort of thought, good for them. But I didn't know how to do that. And there were almost never American flags in demonstrations that I marched in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, because the flag had been taken over by the right. So when Barack Obama was elected in November of 2008, I found myself, well, delighted on the one hand, but also confused. I didn't quite know how to think about it, and I didn't know how to think about patriotism. So it's so funny that that I'm talking now about this, because the origin of that article really took place at a conversation Donna and I had on Wednesday after the Tuesday election that elected Barack Obama. Because I said to her, I said, you got to do something in church, you know, about what happened. And she said, absolutely. I think we got to sing America the Beautiful. And I said, I think it's over the top. And then she said, well, maybe we're going to do God Bless America. And I'm thinking, oh boy, really? Really? You have to do that? It was her father's favorite song, too, by the way, and from whom she was deeply estranged, especially over political issues. So we're at Judson Memorial Church in Greenwich Village in New York City, a place that had become famous in New York because her predecessor there, Howard Moody, had famously defended a flag being burned, either inside the church or just outside the church, because he was very involved with the ACLU in New York. And so Judson had an anti-flag history that was deep and famous and notorious in New York. So the service is going on, and it's time for the anthem, and damn if it isn't God Bless America. And I thought, oh no, really? I mean, I stood along with everybody else, and about a third of the way through, I found myself singing. And I found that lump in my throat that I used to have as a kid. And it was a heck of an experience. And at coffee hour afterwards, I had no idea what had just happened, you know? I mean, I sort of, I wasn't used to this kind of emotion coming out of me by singing the most patriotic and kind of cheesily patriotic songs of all. But there it was, and I was with, and there were a bunch of academics in the congregation, and I said, what did you think about that? And all of us were in the same boat. A lot of us had found ourselves singing this thing that we hadn't sung for decades, that we'd been around, or maybe we'd mouthed the words, but we meant it. And so I wrote this, I was moved to write about it. And that's what led to this article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I excavated my feelings about that song and the patriotism that I loved having as a young man and hadn't had anymore. And I tried to make a case for a progressive patriotism, that folks on the left needed to reclaim patriotism, reclaim the flag, and identify ourselves with this strain that we'd lost over since the Vietnam War, as far as I could tell. And I even began, I went online and bought 100 flag lapel pins. And I began handing them out to people. And I wore one for several years. But the movement did not exactly take off. And I let it go for a while. But it was a powerful moment in my life. And I realized that there's something very important there that I hadn't had access to and wanted access to again. And so when I study history now, I'm really interested in this question of the flag. It turns out that I love seeing the flags at the No Kings rallies. And I didn't really know that I was going to feel that, but to watch the opposition to Donald Trump's policies, which strike me as so profoundly un-American and have nothing to do with the America that I like and occasionally think I love, the flag has been a really important part of what I think of as the resistance movement and the No Kings movement in recent years. I love having that around. I had we began flying a flag in our at our house in West Haven, Connecticut. And I find myself having a completely different relationship to the flag. And I think increasingly it's super important for people who think, like Pam Smith, who's one of the key organizers in town of the No Kings rallies, and all of her colleagues, to go in that direction and to take back the flag that too many of us allowed to go elsewhere for really a couple of generations. And I love being able to have it back. And I love being able to think about myself as a patriot. And to not have people laugh at me for that because I was just a long-haired hippie, for a long time who opposed the war and apparently needed a job, which is what people used to say to me in demonstrations. Come on, you know that. Get a job, right? At that point, I was working 3 jobs, but, it didn't matter. If I had long hair, I clearly didn't have it. I was in need of a job. So I've gone back as a historian to look at how other people have dealt with this issue. And that's what I was proposing to do in the blurb that I did for this seminar. And so I want to do a little bit of that. Not everybody I mentioned is going to make an appearance. It turns out Dolores Huerta said almost nothing about patriotism. She's a phenomenal organizer. She's still alive, by the way. She's going to be at the American Federation of Teachers convention that I'm going to next week and is going to be having a fireside chat about the PBS film about her. She's 96 years old. She has phenomenal things to say, but she never said much about patriotism. But some other people had a whole lot to say about it. And I want to talk a little bit, and I want to talk about that because I think there are going to be some themes that emerge that actually are in common. And I want to begin with something that you all may have seen when it first came out, the 1619 Project, which began as an article in the New York Times Magazine. It was a whole issue of the magazine, edited by Nicole Hannah-Jones. Later became, an educational project, a book. It's reviled by the DeSantis administration, the Trump administration, and the MAGA right. I, on the other hand, found it inspirational. She's made some mistakes, but I don't know, most of you probably don't remember how the magazine article started. And here's how it starts. She's, by the way, an African-American journalist, now teaching at Howard. My dad always flew an American flag in our front yard. The blue paint on our two-story house was sometimes chipped. The fence or the rail by the stairs or the front door might occasionally fall into disrepair, but that flag always flew pristine. Our corner lot, which had been redlined by the federal government, was along the river that divided the black side from the white side of our Iowa town. At the edge of our lawn, high on an aluminum pole, soared the flag, which my dad would replace with a new one as soon as it showed the slightest tatter. This really ticked her off, by the way. She really didn't understand it. She didn't understand how a man who had been treated abysmally by his own government, who he had served in World War II, the Army did not end up being his way out. He was passed over for opportunities, his ambition stunted, he would be discharged under murky circumstances, and then labor in a series of service jobs for the rest of his life. Like all the black men and women in my family, he believed in hard work, but like all the black men and women in my family, no matter how hard he worked, he never got ahead. So when I was young, that flag outside our home never made sense to me. How could this black man, having seen firsthand the way his country abused black Americans, the way it refused to treat us as full citizens, proudly fly its banner? She goes on to say, like most young people, I thought I understood so much, when in fact I understood so little. My father knew exactly what he was doing when he raised that flag. He knew that our people's contributions to building the richest and most powerful nation in the world were indelible, that the United States simply could not exist without us. And I want to read you towards the end of this piece. No one cherishes freedom more than those who have not had it. And to this day, black Americans more than any other group embrace the democratic ideals of the common good. We are the most likely to support programs like universal health care and a higher minimum wage, and to oppose programs that harm the most vulnerable. For instance, black Americans suffer the most from violent crime, yet we are the group most strongly opposed to capital punishment. Our unemployment rate is nearly twice that of white Americans, yet we are still the most likely of all groups to say that this nation should take in refugees who others claim will be a drain on American institutions. As the scholar Joe Fagan put it, enslaved African Americans have been among the foremost freedom fighters this country has produced. I wish now, so she finally understands why her father flies the flag. I wish now I could go back to the younger me and tell her that her people's ancestry started here on these lands, and to boldly, proudly draw the stars and stripes of the American flag. We were once told by virtue of our bondage that we could never be American, but it was by virtue of our bondage that we became the most American of all. So it turns out, historically, black people have taken the promises of the Declaration of Independence to heart in a way that many white Americans have not even seriously thought about. And it turns out that a lot of the people that were excluded from the Constitution were the people that took the promises of the Declaration and the Constitution most seriously. I'm going to read you a few things of some of the people that I told you were going to make an appearance. Thomas Jefferson, was out of public life for a long time. And he lived another 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, he and John Adams both died on the 50th anniversary of July 4th, 1776, which is just one of those sort of historical things. You can't make it up. And if you did, people would tell you to change it because it just doesn't make any sense. But Jefferson, around the time of the Constitution, this is what he thought about what Americans had accomplished during the Revolutionary War. And what country can preserve its liberties? This, by the way, is in a letter to John Adams' son-in-law in 1787, so it's 2 years before the adoption of the Constitution. And what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance? Let them take arms. The remedy is to set them right as to facts, pardon, and pacify them. What signify a few lives lost in a century or two? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is one hell of a quote, right? The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood not only of tyrants but of patriots too. Then, nearly 50 years later, to Adams. Adams and Jefferson had this extraordinary correspondence in the last decade or 15 years of their lives. And he's sad about what's happening in Europe, but he's really happy about what the Declaration of Independence gave, and it gives him a tremendous pride. And even if the cloud of barbarism and despotism again obscure the science and liberties of Europe, this country, meaning the U.S., remains to preserve and restore light and liberty to them. In short, the flames kindled on the 4th of July, 1776, have spread over too much of the globe to be extinguished by the feeble engines of despotism. On the contrary, right, on the contrary, they, that is to say the flames kindled on the 4th of July, on the contrary, they will consume those engines and all who work them. Not bad, huh? Not bad. The Declaration of Independence has been copied by lots of others. When Ho Chi Minh defeated the Japanese in World War II, and the French, and marched into Hanoi and read the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, he modeled it on the American Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson understood that he was part of a worldwide movement. And while he didn't write much about patriotism, he did still take enormous pride in what he and his fellow revolutionaries had wrought in 1776. And that line about, I have to say, I'd like to see that line a lot of places today. The flames kindled on July 4th, 1776, have spread over too much of the globe to be extinguished by the feeble engines of despotism. Because, as Donna pointed out in the sermon today, the tyrants are fundamentally weak. They are fundamentally feeble engines because they don't get people's allegiance. They compel that you follow their laws. They don't get your emotional allegiance. Other people who have talked about the 4th of July. So, Frederick Douglass, I did promise, was going to make an appearance. And lots of you know, and those of you that don't, it's perfectly okay. But on a number of times, he was asked to give 4th of July orations. And this was occasionally difficult for him. In 1852 was one of those times. So 1852 is 8 years before the Civil War starts. Douglas had freed himself in 1845. So he's relatively recently freed. And what was going to happen in the late 1850s with the Dred Scott decision is, even though he addresses the crowd as fellow citizens, Dred Scott said that he couldn't be a citizen of the United States because he had been a slave and because he was African American. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's worth reading the whole thing or listening to it. I am speaking to you with a sad sense of the disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that's brought light and healing to you has brought stripes, that means of the lash, to you. Stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? This is a guy who 7 years earlier was working on a plantation, in a death camp. Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions, whose chains, heavy and grievous yesterday, are today rendered more intolerable by the jubilee shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow this day, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. I think he's quoting the Bible there. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or to the professions of the present, the conduct of the nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion, I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call into question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. And yet, he concludes with this paragraph. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institutions. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Now, he could be speaking for Nicole Hannah Jones's father, only with a kind of eloquence that nobody gets to, right? I mean, there's only one Douglas. There was only, although a certain president thought he was still alive doing good work, but that eloquence is just astonishing. But even Douglas, right? Even Douglas, when the things he just said about the United States are as bad as anything you've heard anyone say ever, right? And he's saying it right to his audience's faces. and he has experienced everything that he talks about. The chains, the beatings, the lashes, all of it. And yet he ends the way he does, going to the Declaration of Independence and going to those promises which are bound to finally be realized. This is amazing to me. And so when I read this and I learned the history around it and learned more about, I mean, we actually named our second son's middle name is Frederick for Douglas. And while he's changed his name, he still has the print of the portrait of Douglas that we gave him from Harper's, and that's in his living room, as well it should be. But what I began to learn in learning the lives of people like Douglas is that he really was buoyed by the spirit of the Declaration and used it. He used it as an organizing tool. He used it as an organizer at this in the same speech that he's making. I mean, you squirmed a little bit hearing that, right? Can you imagine how they felt in Massachusetts when they heard that in 1852? There was a whole lot of squirming in the room. And yet he turns it around to celebrate the possibilities in the Declaration. Astonishing to me. And when I think of my own sort of paltry examples next to his, I'm learning from Douglas. One of the great things of being a historian is that by reading these people over and over, you get to learn from them. And I'm learning from him that I wasted a bunch of decades not talking to my friends about reclaiming the promise of this country that is articulated in the Declaration, and that generations of activists took spiritual and political sustenance from and used it to their and our advantage. Douglas became an advisor to Lincoln during the Civil War. And he talked to Lincoln about the possibility of getting colored troops, a colored regiment raised. One of Douglas's sons actually served in that regiment. And as Ken Burns, I heard him on the radio say the other day that he flew the American flag every day outside his home in Washington, D.C., until he died. If Frederick Douglass could fly the American flag, in the years of Jim Crow and Reconstruction, which was better than slavery, but not that much better, I dare say I can do the same thing. So I take inspiration from this guy. So let's take a detour to Susan B. Anthony. And I have two things I want to do with Susan B. Anthony. One was there was this great kind of insert in the New York Times on Sunday the 5th, and it had some of the 5 great sentences in American history. And one of them is from Susan B. Anthony, because, as some of you know, she and a group of friends in 1872 in Rochester went down to the local polls and voted in the presidential election. This, of course, was completely illegal, and she had a trial, and she was convicted of breaking the law. And then but she also, in her defense, I need some water here. She asked the question, the only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? In the speeches she gave before her trial, she pointed out that the Federal Enforcement Act of 1870, which she had so proudly violated, exclusively used masculine pronouns, as did the printed forms pertaining to her case. The record of her conviction would have to be amended by hand, an S jotted beside the he to make it into she, and so on. And then she said, especially now that we talk so much about pronouns, I insist if government officials may thus manipulate the pronouns to tax fine, imprison, and hang women, women may take the same liberty with them to secure to themselves their right to a voice in government. She invoked New York tax laws that referred only to he, him, and his, and yet weren't taxes collected from women. The suffrage movement appropriated the great credo of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, and pointed out that American women had continued to pay taxes without any say in the laws that governed their lives. At the Centennial Exposition, which was the celebration in 1876 of the Declaration of Independence, Susan B. Anthony was in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, and 6 members of the women's suffrage movement, including Anthony, were given passes to observe the proceedings, but were denied the chance to present their declaration. So after Senator Richard Henry Lee finished reading the original declaration, the women moved to the platform, and Anthony read their declaration to the surprised senator. The women then left the platform and distributed copies of their declaration to the stage and the crowd. And here's some of what she had to say. While the nation is buoyant with patriotism and all hearts are attuned to praise, it is with sorrow we come to strike the one discordant note on this 100th anniversary of our country's birth. Our faith is firm and unwavering in the broad principles of human rights proclaimed in 1776, not only as abstract truths, but as the cornerstones of a republic. Yet we cannot forget, even in this glad hour, that while all men of every race and clime and condition have been invested with the full rights of citizenship under our hospitable flag, all women still suffer the degradation of disfranchisement. Taxation without representation, the immediate cause of the rebellion of the colonies against Great Britain, is one of the grievous wrongs the women of this country have suffered during the century. Deploring war with all the demoralization that follows in its train, we have been taxed to support standing armies with their waste of life and wealth. Believing in temperance, we have been taxed to support the vice, crime, and pauperism of the liquor traffic. And moreover, we are taxed to support the very legislators and judges who make laws and render decisions adverse to women. And now, at the close of 100 years, as the hour hand of the great clock that marks the centuries points to 1876, we declare our faith in the principles of self-government, our full equality with man in natural rights, that woman was made first for her own happiness with the absolute right to herself, to all the opportunities and advantages life affords for her complete development, and we deny that dogma of the centuries incorporated in the codes of all nations, that woman was made for man, her best interests in all cases to be sacrificed to his will. We ask of our rulers at this hour no special favors, no special privileges, no special legislation. We ask justice, we ask equality, and we ask that all the civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters forever. You know, there's this tendency to think, because we don't really see people like Susan B. Anthony as real people, that they're these kind of staid icons in old, 19th century dress, that they didn't really have the kind of fire and passion that we expect from these political leaders. But, there's so much blood on the page there. There's so much energy in this. And of course, they did it as an intervention. And they had to do it. They had to be not nice girls. They bullied their way onto the platform, and they already had copies of the Declaration that they could circulate. They were organizers on a grand scale. So what I've come to believe, and I found people talking about this when I began looking for it, is that the great thing about the Declaration and the country that it founded is that so it did come. Is it raining yet? Just thunder. Oh God, our poor dog. Well, she's under your desk at least, right? She hates a thunderstorm. So what I found so compelling is that generations of people who have been denied all kinds of rights found inspiration in the Declaration and saw it as an opening to push for more. They didn't think it was complete. You have new solutions and new problems. But they saw it as a way to gird themselves, one, to get the fundamental rights, and two, to open the door to do so much more. Martin Luther King, at the March on Washington, talked about the Declaration this way. No, I'm not going to go to King right now, because I promised Lincoln. And lots of you had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. Fewer of us remember it. And even fewer of us spent much time thinking about it. But it's a truly remarkable speech. And so I'm going to read the last sentence or two of that, because here, and the reason why it's come down to us is because Lincoln is really reframing the meaning of American democracy. And he's taking the occasion of the reinterment of all of these many, many tens of thousands of corpses, actually, at Gettysburg, at the dedication of the cemetery, to talk about what it meant and what their sacrifice meant, and what the Civil War means, even though we're still in the middle of it. It's 1863. And no one really knows at that point that the Battle of Gettysburg is the turning point in the war. They just don't know. You all know this sentence. The world will little note, and by the way, this is the one point where he was completely wrong. And I badly need a glass of water. Oh, thank you. That's fine. You're out of the classroom for a while. Voice isn't used to it. So this is where he really, the first sentence, of course, is completely wrong. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what we did here. And here's where it starts to get interesting. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It's up to us to keep this work going. They took a step forward, but it's really a gift to us and a responsibility laid on us to make these promises work. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. And that's partly, of course, to win the war. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. So, for Lincoln, what Gettysburg means is that the sacrifice made by the soldiers here gives us the responsibility to carry forth the work. The Declaration isn't enough. The victory isn't enough. It's a solution, but there are more problems ahead of us. The work is not over. It is ongoing. And that, I think, is what the brilliance is of these historical figures who have grappled with what the foundation of this country, knowing full well that it was founded in slavery, that it was founded by enslavers, that it was founded making sure that women had no rights, that Native Americans had no rights. And yet they took those words and the promise of those words as a kind of a North Star, as a kind of encouragement to keep moving, that this is a country in process, always in process. And we hear this from Frederick Douglass, who takes encouragement from the Declaration after what he told that bunch of people on July 4th in 1852. Susan B. Anthony's doing the same thing. And here's Lincoln after the incredible slaughter of Gettysburg and a war he didn't know the Union was going to win, talking about the unfinished project and taking inspiration from that. Now, very quickly, he says, who can take him seriously? How does Martin Luther King begin his speech at the March on Washington in August 1963? When the architects of our republic, right, wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He feels the need, the command almost, to go, and the inspiration to go back to the founding when he's in front of that reflecting pool with all those people. At the Lincoln Memorial, right? I mean, this matters that he's at the Lincoln Memorial. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as its citizens of color are concerned. Now I want to take a big jump. Barack Obama, I learned a lot of this just in the last couple days. Barack Obama gave a speech at Selma in the last year of his presidency. And it took, so I guess it was 2012, and it was on Bloody Sunday. And the speech went through at least 5 drafts. And he was tweaking it as he basically went to the stage in Selma. And it's because he got deeply into what Bloody Sunday meant, what John Lewis was up to meant, and what the civil rights movement had meant. And here's a little bit of what he said there. But what great, because what he was doing is wrestling with the idea of American exceptionalism, which he believed in, but it took him a while to articulate exactly what he thought about it. And in writing this speech, he went through a lot of different versions of it. And I'm just going to read from you a little bit of it. But what greater expression of faith in the American idea, what greater form of patriotism is there than to believe that America is not yet finished, that it's strong enough to be self-critical, that each generation can look upon its imperfections and say that we can do better. What could be more American than what happened in this place that he's talking about, the Edmund Pettus Bridge? What could more profoundly vindicate the idea of America than plain and humble people, the unsung, the downtrodden, the dreamers not of high station, not born to wealth or privilege, not of one religious tradition, but many, coming together to shape their country's course? That's what America is. Not stock photos or airbrushed history or feeble attempts to define some of us as more American than others. We respect the past, but we don't pine for the past. We don't fear the future. We grab for it. America is not some fragile thing. I couldn't believe listening to your sermon today, Donna, because I just decided to use, I just read it and I just decided to use it this morning. We don't fear the future. We grab for it. America is not some fragile thing. So, questions, comments?
Are we going to sing America the Beautiful?
I'll probably forget the words. And,
So how do we safeguard inclusive patriotism how do we safeguard inclusive patriotism from isolationist nationalism? If we both have the same flag.
so, repeat the question. Okay, I got to repeat the question. How do we save inclusive patriotism from isolationist nationalism? What Harvey Ward said when he was here? He said, talk to your neighbors. Talk to your neighbors. You people, I couldn't believe when I walked into the sanctuary this morning that I was going to be talking about this and you had the Remembrance Project quilts up. And I only saw the ones that were at the front of the sanctuary until I walked out because I don't have eyes in the back of my head. And then I realized that they were all up and I thought, oh my goodness, you folks have made such a community here. You're not afraid of the past. You, like no community I've ever known, you folks are not afraid of the past. You've looked at a horrifying past and come to terms with it and taken a charge from Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative to do something that almost no one else in the country is doing, to grapple with the horrifying nature of the past and to make art out of it. You don't need my advice. You folks are doing it. It's just astonishing. I've never been in such a place. It's a real privilege to be here. You folks tell me that there were more lynchings in Alachua County than any other county in Florida, and maybe in the whole United States. Flo was just telling me this morning about a book I should get to read about the Klan, and I think it's called The Age of Barbarity in Florida. So I know there's horrible stuff here, but you folks don't sit on your butts and wring your hands about it. You actively engage with that history and create art and inspiration out of it. You folks are doing it in a way that's really quite remarkable. You should give yourself, don't just a pat on the back. You should applaud what you've done, what you're doing for each other. You have a right to take pride in that. And so you don't need my advice there. I'll get to you later, Glenn. Go on.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. I went to Fannie.
I beg your pardon?
I went to Florida A&M University. And
You've got to hold the mic closer to your mouth.
okay, I went to Florida A&M University. Professor Eaton up there was teaching American history from the perspective of the black experience. I was blown away. I learned about Tuskegee, and I learned about the firebombing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, all those kinds of things that went on. And I really appreciate the optimism of Douglas that you pointed out, and the optimism of Susan B. Anthony, and all I don't need to name them. You all heard it. Anyway, I have been playing with this idea. I pledge allegiance to the Constitution and the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, optional, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As an edit, that under God was added in 1954 in the McCarthy era. And it just, it doesn't have to come out, but the word Constitution should go before the word flag.
Well, I wish you were there, but I don't think we're going to be able to do that. And I think that, you know, none of these people actually changed the Constitution or the Declaration. They reinterpreted it. They made it their own. And that's what I want to learn from what they were able to do. Glenn.
Kind of in response to Edda's question, I don't know if how many folks realize that Franklin Roosevelt, during the precursor to World War II, ran as an isolationist because of the of that atmosphere in the country. Most Americans didn't want to get involved in another European war. Woodrow Wilson did the same. Yet, circumstances resulted in the fact that we could not ignore the rest of the world. And I suspect that's what we're going to find during this era of pseudo-isolationism.
Anyway, I think we're a little off topic here, so let's try to stick on what we've been after so far. Yes, Elizabeth.
Actually, I can speak quite
No, but no one can hear you online if you don't use the mic.
Okay. Only that absolutely our heroes, our heroines of history are wonderful. But what we have now is people on our doorstep that we have to serve, whether they're in the streets or the immigrants about to be deported, or God help them, the people in our prisons, some of whom we're murdering and some of whom we're just torturing. But so I love history and I love hearing from a historian. But we have to do now, aside from the political organizing and the phone calls, we have to serve the people that are being destroyed by what's going on now. I'm not. I have a great life.
I hear you. Absolutely. None of this, I realize there's a tendency, we could get in hero worship or shiro worship of great figures in the past. But what they're saying to us is not worship me. They're not saying be like me. They're saying do what I'm doing. Take the same kind of inspiration that I have taken. And if I can do it, maybe you can do it too. And do it better, and absolutely do it better, and do it forward, not back. I became a historian for probably two reasons. One is because I wanted to figure out how the hell we got into Vietnam, and I felt like I had to know that. But the other is I gained tremendous inspiration from these figures in the past, who I feel like are talking to me about what I should be doing, and the way I should be talking to other people about what we need to be doing.
The Racial Justice Committee.
Yes, you're on.
The Racial Justice Committee, being led now by Sherry and Terry, invite you to take one of these wonderful model letters from the table in the back and do it. Write the candidates who are running and tell them that we want equality for all.
Thank you, Jackie. It's coming, Helen. And I know you've got a big voice.
Thank you very much. This has been an inspirational morning with all the discussions we've been having. But when I think about like my generation being of the 70s and how we thought the people older, who I am now one of, were the people who did nothing, with the issue of climate change and where the world is environmentally, I sometimes hear the younger people say that our generation, failed them. And I'll reply to them, it's a relay race. And people of my generation were doing things, but I later realized that there were people before us who were doing things. And just the beauty of the idea of the relay race. It may never happen in my lifetime, but we must strive for that.
I love that image, Helen. That's a phenomenal image. It's a relay race. We are not called upon to do everything. None of us can do everything. All of us can do something. And it takes people at so many different levels and energy levels and ability levels. No, I mean, how many of us are as eloquent as Frederick Douglass? Nobody, right? But we can be inspired by Douglass. We can teach Douglass to our children. And we can help pass the baton. Passing the baton is a really important thing. But it's also good that there's a baton to pass. Yes. Right? Right? Yes. Carol, can we get her a mic?
Speaking of passing the torch, Pam is receiving the Susan B. Anthony Award this year.
What? Who's giving the award? I know, but who's giving the award? Who gives the Susan B. Anthony Award?
Oh gosh, I believe it's the Democratic Women's Group. No, it's a
The
specific.
Friends of Susan B. Anthony in Florida, or?
Annual luncheon here is a local group.
Well, congratulations. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate you being here.
Are you a soccer fan at all?
I've been watching all the World Cup.